Hey everyone, welcome back to Keto and Crime and Thought Crime. This is our first episode of the month of Funnoween. We're going to be doing we're going to stay true to the true crime genre, but we're going to be doing some fun stuff like some horror movie commentary, and I'm going to be talking about reviewing some movies that are related to true crime cases we've already covered, so I thought you would enjoy that as well. And we're going to be just talking about some fun things. Stay in the lighter side. There's a lot of misery out there with the current illness, and then, politics is never pretty. So there's a lot of bad stuff out there right now. So I want to kind of counter that and give us something maybe to look forward to as I put out 3 to 4 videos a week during the month of October, which is my favorite month. I love Halloween. So today we're going to get started with that. And thanks to all of you that reviewed my new intro. Hope you enjoyed it. And we are going today to talk about yet another Chad Daybell book. Now, I thought, with everything that I've already read, that we were safe from Mr. Daybell. However, just like Jaws, he keeps coming back. And he actually has a very small book. It's about 104 pages. Most of his books are around 100 and something pages. When you write on full-length notebook paper, notebook paper, you see how old I am. When you write on full-length paper, normal page out of a notebook or something, that's holds a lot of words. But when you publish as a Kindle, which is how I read this one, those pages are very small. They don't hold maybe half or a third of the words that regular size paper does. And yet all of his books are around 104 pages. So makes you realize just how short his books are. So if that's any indication of the caliber of the writing we're dealing with. But anyway, so this one is called One Foot in the Grave, Tales from a Graveyard Sexton. And I was hoping for some really good ghost stories that I could relate to you guys. Ones that he actually believed happened to him. There's a few, but mostly it's like telling us how to behave around a graveyard, which it's not etiquette that I've ever really wondered about, and I doubt you have either. So it leads us to believe exactly where his mind is. So the thought that he would actually need to tell us how to behave in a graveyard. But it's still humorous, and we're going to talk about it today. I'm going to take you through each chapter, give a little summary of it, and we'll have a good time. So with that, let me give a quick shout out to my patrons and my channel members. I will put a timestamp down below if you'd like to skip that. But here we go. First to my patrons. Cindy Lunsford, welcome. Roger Cope, Mary Rawat, Maybe Sunshine, Laurie Holmes, Zachary Reese, Kimberly Jolly, Kate Willett, Lauren Kirk, Sarah Carney, Andrea Lee, Tabora Summers Cooper, Demelza Pascoe, and Chloe. And for my wonderful channel members, Kimmy Middleton, Dr. Debo Cherry, Chef Betsy, Mama Bear, Stephanie Ceresi, Lauren Cass, Zach Reese, Flame Lily, Hippie Dotson, Joe Guitar, Kat Middleton, Enigma X, Maybe Sunshine, and Stephanie Mertz. Thank you so much. It was with your support that I was able to purchase both the new camera, still about a $30 camera, and a wonderful new Yeti microphone, which I think is going to improve the sound quality tremendously. Let me know what you think. Anyway, so without further ado, let's get into it. One Foot Inside the Grave, Chad Daybell. Chapter 1, called Step Inside, If You Dare. So he talks about how this is going to be one part spooky stories, and the rest is his take on how people should behave around a graveyard. Again, why do we need to know that, Chad? But anyway, so, most of us like to spend as little time as possible in a graveyard, present company excluded. But anyway, he starts out telling us kind of a spooky story. Basically, it was after he had dug a grave. It was during a snowstorm, and a friend of hers and their friends were driving past the cemetery going home, and this friend said that she saw, as she passed one of the gates, a middle-aged lady beckoning them, carrying a baby in her arms, beckoning them back into the graveyard. And like all people in horror movies, this person decided to follow the ghost instead of driving home. But she said she followed the ghostly woman into the cemetery for quite a little while, and then she went behind a tree and disappeared. They didn't find any footprints from this supposed lady, and the only prints in the snow were the ones made by their own car. So, yeah, I'm not sure what the purpose of that story was, but okay, I suppose it was a ghost of a woman and her baby. But anyway, then he goes into why you should never call people that work in a cemetery grave diggers, and how there are proper titles, because goodness forbids we should call Chad Daybell by anything other than what he wants to be called. So he said he's not a grave digger, he's not the lead grave digger, he's a sexton. And then he tells us the history of how sextons were often associated with being a groundskeeper of a church, and how in Old England most graveyards were attached to a church. So therefore it kind of carried over. Even now most graveyards are private corporations, either attached to a specific funeral home or just independent on their own, and they are not necessarily attached to a church, but they still call them sextons, because again, God forbid he should be called a grave digger. Anyway, then he goes into how death is a mystery, and how no one really knows what happens. And in olden times, most people died at home, whereas now most people die in a hospital or as a virtue of an accident, and how death is really a mystery. What happens to us at death is a mystery. And to that I say, bunkus, death is not that much of a mystery. So, when you die, whatever happens to you, your vital organs shut down. Usually the heart, and then it shuts down everything else. Unless, of course, you're dying of liver failure or kidney failure. Not trying to bring up bad images, but organs start to fail. When the heart goes and the blood stops pumping, that's when physical life actually expires. Even though the brain can stay alive for minutes afterwards, and that's where a lot of people think they've, when they're a near-death experience, it could be a hallucination of the brain. It could be, even in death, you're probably dreaming. And that's where people that say they see the light or whatever may go. Now, that's scientific description. I'm not telling anybody how to look at things spiritually. Now, what happens to you after death, spiritually, whatever your beliefs are, that could be yet a mystery. But as far as what I believe when you die, it's over. When your brain shuts down, you are clinically dead, and you just cease to exist, and you drop off into a very slumbered sleep forever. And then your body starts to break down, and you return to the matter, to the earth, to the universe from which you came. So it's not such a mystery, Chad. You like to say it's a mystery so that your bogus writings make sense, but no, we got you figured out. So then he says he's going to debunk a lot of myths, talk some true stories, and, make us smile with real life graveyard stories. But I can't really say anything. I read this book. Anyway, he wants to first take us through what is true about working in a graveyard versus what's not true. He said, leave all preconceived ideas of what we may think goes on in a cemetery at the gate. Okay. He starts with what he says is the most common misperception, that all graves are 6 feet. He said that may have been true in Old England, but technically nowadays they dig 5 feet. And he also wants you to know that old myth that if you fall into a grave, you'll never get out is also a myth, because again, also 5 feet. He then says that, contrary to popular belief, you do not just bury a coffin into a freshly dug grave. There is a vault, which is cement, which is a larger coffin-like thing that engulfs both the coffin and the body. It has been pre-put into the grave by the vault company. And we no longer just bury people directly in the dirt, which I don't know who actually thinks that, but at least in the modern world, I don't know who actually thinks that, but it is a vault. And he also talks about how that's why you never see the vault at a burial. It's already in there. And I often wonder what psychopath wonders these things. But then again, I did read this book, so. He tells us the process by which a vault is placed in a grave. The company actually arrives a few hours before the burial. They place the concrete, using planks, they place the concrete vault into the grave. Everything except the lid, which is usually hidden somewhere off to the side. And then he says that the next time you're at a burial, look down, you'll see a concrete slab, which is the bottom of the vault. Then they lower it in there with some straps, which are then unhooked, and then a dump truck comes and takes away the dirt that has just been dug from the 5-foot hole. It takes it away to a certain place. It waits. After the funeral, when they start to bury the person, they bring that dump truck back and they just dump the dirt right back into the grave. And then the sextons spread it out and pat it down. He says you'll very rarely see a pile of dirt just sitting covered with a tarp. He says some people do that, but for the most part, the dirt is taken away by a dump truck and then brought back because it leads to much quicker burial instead of somebody having to, by shovelfuls, knock the dirt back in. But again, who actually wonders this, Chad? So he then tells an amusing story about a woman that had died and had already been buried. They were smoothing out the last of the dirt on top of her grave when a family member comes running back screaming that they have accidentally buried her wedding ring with her and her husband wants it. It was an elderly lady. So he said that that's the one thing a sexton never wants to hear, that they have to redig a freshly dug grave. He said the dump truck had already gone, so they had to dig. He said since he's a public servant, they had to dig back into the grave, just piling the dirt up. They got down to the vault. They lifted the vault lid off. He jumped down into the grave with the family member that wanted it. They opened the casket. He pulled up the loved one's hand and somehow wrenched the wedding ring off her finger, put her down, and then said thank you and left. And Chad had to close the coffin, relatch it. Then he had to, with help, of course, put the vault lid back on, and then they had to, instead of having a dump truck, just dump the dirt back in there. They had to start shoveling it in. He did say he ran and got the cemetery's backhoe, came in and knocked some of it in, and then they reburied the person. And then he said a few days later, after a burial, that the tombstone company will actually come and place the tombstone. Unless the family wants it there at the funeral, then it will already be there. But he said redigging a grave is a very rare occurrence. Thank goodness. That wonderful, enlightening, heartwarming story now ends chapter 1, and we go into chapter 2, which is called Who Will Bury Me? And that's where he tells us about each and every person in the grave chain of command, I suppose. He starts with morticians, which he boldly says that it's mostly male. It has for years been mostly males that serve as morticians, which do the embalming and the funeral itself at home. They're usually called funeral directors, but technically they're called morticians. And they have to go to college, at least a 2-year program, or complete an apprenticeship while working at a funeral home. And they are the face of the funeral. They dress very professionally. He said it's normally always been men, but more and more women are coming into this, and he thinks it will eventually become a very mixed profession. Thank you, Chad, for one non-misogynistic comment. Thank you. He then tells us that a mortician, regardless of their gender, needs to have a good sense of humor, be able to comfort the family, be stoic, and yet get right down to business because they make their money on the funeral. And if any of you, I'm going to tell a story here. When my Nana, and this is her house, when she passed, she was well into her 90s, I went with my mother-in-law and my wife to make preparations for her cremation. And while we were sitting in there, of course, everybody's heart was very heavy, and I tend to joke inappropriately when I am heavy in heart. And we were sitting there with the young lady funeral director, and she was explaining to us the costs of various urns and things like that, the cremation itself and the urns. And then my mother-in-law just asked, well, what are we looking at? I just want her in a nice classic, metal urn, and then, just a basic cremation. And she quoted $5,000. And we were kind of silent for a minute. And I, of course, very inappropriately said, $5,000? And then the woman goes, well, that includes us shipping her to wherever she wants her ashes spread and taking care of that for her. And I said, $5,000? How much if we use my Zippo? And then I was into it, and everybody else was like, what? And I'm like, yeah, how about if you just use my Zippo, and then we can have UPS pick her up? It took a few minutes, but my mother-in-law finally burst into laughter, which is what I was going for. Very inappropriate. My whole thing with that story, don't bring me along unless you have a very inappropriate sense of humor, because I will embarrass you. Anyway, but he's talking about, and that funeral director, just as Mr. Daybell says here, was very stoic. She chuckled, but it was right down to business, and we ended up, of course, paying the money. But then he goes on to other people, and he goes into what a graveyard or cemetery or burial company or crematory, whatever you're going to, secretary, and how they're usually female. Again, he said one night, now he's back to a sexist, but anyway. But it's true, normally they are women. He talks about how they're young and efficient. You don't see a whole lot of middle-aged women or, older women in this job. It's usually very young, pretty, your misogyny showing, and just very, very well-groomed, put-together people. And then I remember, wasn't Tammy the graveyard secretary that helped you get your first job? So, okay, yeah, I think Mr. Daybell has an affinity for graveyard secretaries. Anyway, and he does say that they have to put on a brave front, because lots of times they're the ones that take the anger of the family, because the family has to go there, unless the funeral home owns the graveyard, and they're going to another graveyard to be buried, they have to deal with the church secretary as far as getting a plot, and if something is not right, the secretary has to take it, and also the secretary has to record a reason of death, and if Uncle Johnny was killed robbing a bank, they often take that out on the secretary. Then he comes to the sexton, which is him, which is usually male. It's the lead grave digger. And not just that, but also the engineer, the one that helps plot out the graveyard so that every single grave everybody knows every specific address. He said graves are just like addresses, like houses. They all have a number, so you know exactly where to go. He has to plot that out. He has to arrange the logistics for burying somebody and make sure that no mistakes are made. And that's the reason that sextons are usually employees of the city if they have a city graveyard, or they're an employee of the funeral the funeral home or whoever owns the graveyard. And they're usually very well paid, because they're not only the lead grave digger, they're also the manager of the graveyard, so to speak. And that you have to be very, very kind, very good with logistics, and be good at PR. Don't mean to toot your own horn there, do you, Mr. Daybell? And he talks about the sexton staff, also called assistant sextons, which are the grave diggers and, people that, do maintenance around the graveyard, that sort of thing. Basically assistant sextons. And how he has very rarely ever hired a female. I bet you haven't. And how it's usually young kids that are just starting out. He might have one, he says, good, solid employee that's really his right-hand man, but everybody else comes and goes because it's a hard, gritty, almost very disturbing type of job. And so he usually finds one person that, has the chutzpah to take the full sexton job after the sexton leaves, but for the most part, it's just young kids that you have to keep an eye on. And then he goes on to talk about riding lawnmower personnel. These are the landscapers and yard caretakers that mow the graveyard. And he says that normally for an average size graveyard, you have to have at least 2 to 3 people that are mowing the lawn on riding lawnmowers or standing lawnmowers 8 hours a day because it grows fast. And he said, so normally these people are retired men, veterans that just want some supplemental income in retirement because it doesn't pay very much, and they usually find it relaxing. And he says one of their duties is to also flirt with the widows. Okay, Chad. Okay. And then he goes on to talk about the vault company and the headstone companies, which are normally private companies. Again, unless you're dealing with a large funeral home that owns the whole shebang, or a large burial company, that these are the people that come and bring the vaults and bring the coffins or those kind of things and the headstone, and they come in very separate. It's usually paid directly by the family, or if they take out a complete funeral package, it's taken care of. But anyway, these are the people that bury you. And then I really find it amazing that Chad Daybell is so obsessed and so intricate with the care and daily operations of a cemetery. I think I see a pattern forming here, don't you? And with that, we move into chapter 3, which is a list of graveyard do's and don'ts. And again, this is for who wondered that. Anyway, so he talks about don't remove your clothing at funerals, and then tells a story about how a young bride, when her husband was killed at war, actually did remove part of her garments and almost fling herself into the grave. So yeah, I'll just leave that right there for you guys. Don't smoke until the service is over. Seems pretty cut and dry. Don't yell at the sexton if you are upset. Okay, I would say don't yell at anybody if you're upset. And then he goes about, do bring the sexton a pizza. And this is especially if you want the sexton to take extra good care of your loved one's gravesite. And then, of course, he goes into a story. And he talks about a woman that would bring him a Pizza Hut medium supreme pizza once or twice a month in exchange for him keeping an eye on her son's gravesite. And he said that he would go by there every other day or so. He would polish up the gravestone. He would take, even after the guy had cut the grass and weed eated around the area, he would take small pruning shears and take care of all the little grass growing up around the headstone. And he would really take good care of that. And I often wondered, what would you do, Chad, for a large pizza and some breadsticks? Is that how Lori paid you? Anyway, and then he talks about don't betray the sexton's trust, whatever that means, and do obey the posted signs. And then he starts by saying, and whatever you do, don't ruin the sexton's life. And I'm like, what? And then he goes into a story. He said that a woman who had just died and her family were in the midst of some sort of inheritance squabble, which really lets you know how evil people can be when money's involved. And one side of the family wanted her disinterred and moved to another town. So they went out, and he had to go out there with his backhoe and basically dig up the woman's grave. And a trucking company and burial company came and took the entire vault away. They pulled the vault out. They didn't disturb it. So coffin, body, everything. And they took her headstone and everything, and they took her to the new cemetery and reburied her. Okay, so he and his guys basically dumped the dirt back into this freshly dug out grave, patted it down, noted that it was gravesite 152 and that it was open now, and then they went about their business. So he said about a week later, Even though it looked like a freshly dug grave, as you can imagine, the headstone guy came for another lady, and his work order said Site 152, and he put the gravestone there in what looked like a freshly dug grave. However, the numbers were inversed on the work order, and it should have been Site 251, which is about, Chad said, about 200 yards away. So he noticed it, and unfortunately, after the person had placed it, there was a snowstorm, so for several weeks it was covered with snow, and he had noticed people going to what he knew was an empty grave and placing flowers and mourning. He didn't, he thought that was funny, but he went up and he looked, he said, oh my gosh, somebody put a gravestone here. And then he realized, okay, this should be on 251. So he and his crew just moved the gravestone to the correct grave, which was a real woman's grave with no headstone, and replaced her headstone. Well, the family who had been going to that site thought they had just dug up their relative and moved her, and they actually took Chad to the city council, and he explained what had happened. He got the gravestone company to show the invoice and all that, but they were determined it was a conspiracy, and in the end Chad had to issue a public apology, and that's what he meant by don't try to ruin the sexton's life. And then he goes on about ask the sexton to help you locate a grave. As he said, every grave has an address, just like a house. Don't read in the cemetery at night. Who does that besides you, Chad? Don't ask a sexton to work the graveyard shift. and do pay attention to the person directing traffic at a funeral and a burial. And don't expect to borrow electricity. And he goes into this story about a woman that wanted to put a small Christmas tree with lights on her son's grave, and how she wanted to run an extension cord from the sexton's office, which was near enough her son's grave, to get the electricity. And he had to tell her no, because he was afraid the lawn guys wouldn't see it and run over the extension cord and electrocute somebody. Don't move previously buried bodies. Again, who does this, Chad? Don't ride on the cemetery's dirt pile. So I guess don't play in the cemetery's dirt. Again, who does this but you, Chad? And don't call the cops about your headstone. If your headstone is damaged, talk to the sexton. Again, who does this? A lot of Karens out there, I guess. All right, and with that, we go into chapter 4. And this is a bunch of bizarre but true stories. So let's get into it. He told the story of 𝗟𝐿𝐵𝑒𝐻 of Springfield, Missouri, who was an 82-year-old former groundskeeper and circus trainer of elephants. And when he died, he had a single pallbearer, an elephant by the name of Broadway Beau, and a smaller elephant named Buddy that led the funeral procession of Shorty's coffin and actually placed him into the vault. So I thought that was pretty cool. And then he talked about how often graveyards are subject to a lot of criminal mischief, how they will come into the grounds and they will steal the batteries off of the back, the backhoe, the lawnmowers, the stuff that they need, and how they will often cut the gas lines and drain the gas. He said he doesn't understand why they would do this, but he says he's seen it happen many, many times, which leads me to believe why there isn't more security at a graveyard. Anyway, so then he goes into a story of a man that wanted to be buried with all of his adult magazines, and there were so many of them that they had to actually stack them in the vault. And he said he had issues with his crew trying to steal them. So thank you, Chad. I will often think about that. And with that, we go into chapter 5, which is myth versus fact. So this is a very short chapter, just about some common myths. I'm only going to go over a few of them, but he says that myth number 1, the headstone is facing where the body is buried. He said, wrong, it's always facing on the west end of the grave. People often get married in the wrong place. That's a myth. He said very rarely. It happens once every few years. And he says that another myth is that graveyards and cemeteries are death still. He says absolutely not. They're pretty noisy during the day and at night. And then he says that another myth is when you buy a burial plot, you own it and you can do whatever you wish with the property. And he said, in fact, you're just leasing it and you can't. And then again, that whole myth about if you fall in a grave, you'll never get out. And he says they're only 5 feet deep, so most people can just climb right out. And then we go into chapter 6, which he calls Outfoxing the Grim Reaper. He starts telling us the story of Bill and Ted's Excellent Adventure, you know, the movie. So anyway, I just kind of zoned out. But then he finally gets back into what he's saying, and it's talking about how you've often heard that death comes in threes, and he says he has a real problem with that because there are lots of strange patterns when it comes to burials, and he talks about how he might have one section of the cemetery, like a lot of people think that if one person dies and is buried in the section of the cemetery within a few weeks, 2 more people will die. He says that's not true. Lots of times there will be months in between burials in a certain section of the cemetery, and then there will also be times where 10 people end up buried within 2 months in the same area of the cemetery. So he said it's just a popular myth. I don't know who has these myths on their minds. I don't even know if they are myths. I'm just going by what Mr. Daybell says. And then he tells us how he marks out new graves. Basically, he said every grave, when they buy new land, they go out and they plot it out just like a surveyor. They assign each plot a physical address based on what they call their little pathways through the cemetery. Those are all named with street and road names, just like in a community, and which is kind of spooky of how he thinks in a graveyard, about a graveyard, that it's a community. And he says, but those are all plotted out like roads and streets, and they will actually go out, mark off the graves, which are all the same, mostly the same length, and give each thing an address, and the sexton will do that. And then, once someone dies, they will make sure they have the correct address of the grave. They will go and they will mark it off with plywood boards so that the sextons know, his assistant sextons know where to dig the graves. And then they will come back later and dig it with a backhoe. The dump truck will take the dirt away and blah, 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 blah. And then he literally gives us a list of holidays and the most popular times to decorate a grave. Again, why does anyone need to know this? And then he goes into chapter 7, which is called Cemetery Blunders, which actually kind of did give me a bit of a chuckle. But he talked about a dump truck accident while digging a grave, that the dump truck was waiting to haul away the dirt. They had just filled it up, and it was parked about 2 feet from the grave. And he said once the dump truck was ready to go, the guy started it, but he accidentally put it in reverse instead of forward, instead of drive, and reversed, and ended up with the dump truck's 2 back tires and part of its back section in the grave. And it took them a pulley system on their backhoe and some planks to ever get the guy out. And they had to jump down in there and redig out the dirt that had spilled into there. And he said it was just weird. And then he told the story of a sprinkler line, because he said most cemeteries are sprinkled, that actually busted and ended up filling an entirely freshly dug grave, vault and all, like a swimming pool. And they had to quickly bring in pumps and pump it out and clean it up before the funeral. And then he talked about another time when he was tasked with getting a rotten limb off of a tree that was overhanging one of the driveways. And he was out there actually just trying to swing on it and pull it down. It wouldn't, so he realized he had to go get a chainsaw. So he went, or an axe or something, and he went to go get that. He came back, and a hearse had tried to drive underneath that tree, and I guess the tree limb had taken it out at that time to drop on the hearse, and they blamed him for it, saying he had loosened it and done it on purpose. Again, Chad, what are you doing? Then he tells tales of screaming relatives, just relatives taking their anger out on the funeral staff. So don't do that. And then chapter 7 ends and we go into chapter 8, Surviving the Survivors, where he told a couple of tales that really brought me to tears. But talked about a man named Wayne that visited his wife's grave every hour on the hour. They had been married over 50 years, and he was home alone, and he would drive back every hour on the hour to visit his wife's grave. And he did this for over a month. And he said they could set their watches by it. And that the guy appeared to be erratically driving. And one day Chad followed him because he was worried about him. And he did like drive erratically through the traffic, almost caused a couple of accidents. And Chad kind of followed him back and forth that day just in case, and ended up calling the couple's son and instructing them of what had happened. And sure enough, they took him and had his license revoked, and he ended up dying 3 months later and being buried next to his wife, which, yeah, thanks for that, Chad. And then another story of a middle-aged man whose wife had died young. His name was John. He visited his wife 2 times a day, every day, like at 11 a.m. and 3 p.m. on the dot. He was there. He would leave work. He would take breaks and leave work and come visit his wife. And they said, again, they could set their clocks by this. But one day, a new lawnmower guy accidentally knocked over the wife's headstone with the mower and actually impaled the mower on it. So here's the headstone, here's the mower. He knocked it over and ended up driving up over it and was stuck kind of like this. And it said it took them, they had exactly like 2 hours before his next visit. So they managed to get chains and the backhoe and get the mower off. And they said miraculously the stone was not damaged, but there was a huge tire print going down the front. And they had to spend like an hour polishing up the stone, and they finally got it clean and replaced it, and they never knew. But what would you have done, Chad, if it had split it right down the middle? Anyway. And then he told a humorous story of a man that right before they started throwing and pushing the dirt back into the grave, he asked if he could place something in the vault with his father, a last meal. And the guy said sure, and he put in there a 6-pack of caffeine-free Coca-Cola and a jar of Planters unsalted peanuts. And Chad said, he humorously said, hey, why don't you give him the good stuff, Let him live a little, ha-ha. And the guy goes, oh, he was on a special diet. That's kind of funny, actually. And, of course, that's where chapter 8 ends, and we go into chapter 9, where he talks about meddling ghosts, so finally some ghost stories. And he says that he saw many, many ghosts, I bet you did, when he was digging graves. And he often saw them immediately after they were buried. And he said that to him, most ghosts are people with unfinished business. And then he told the story of Eddie, who was actually mentioned in his biography, Living on the Edge of Heaven, who was a petty thief and a vagrant. And he said after he was buried, he found lots of his sheds broken into, the locks picked, things kind of tumbled around, that he would open the windows to the women's restroom. And finally, he said that he actually put a test out for Eddie. Like, he tied some plastic around some locks, and sure enough, he came in the next day, they were off. Now, whether or not this was a ghost or just happenstance, we don't know. But he said once that happened, he just stood, looked toward Eddie's grave, and said, Eddie, go toward the light. And he said after that, it stopped. So, like, he wheeled Eddie to go to heaven, or wherever Eddie was going. And then he told another story of a guy that had shot both his wife and himself. And there was a huge tumult with the family because, of course, the kids didn't want their mom buried next to the man that had shot her, even though it was their father. But they ended up being buried side by side, and the police actually had to be there at the funeral to prevent a fight. And then he said after they had finished laying the dirt over both of them, he said he could feel the spirit of the husband lingering, trying to justify what had happened to what he had done to his wife, to Chad, saying she deserved it, she forced me, blah, 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 blah. Very ironic that Chad should say that a psychopath, abuser, and killer would try to justify things to him. But again, he told him to go toward the light. And was that a preview of things to come, Chad? Anyway, then we get into chapter 10, which is the final chapter where he just gives us a few final tips. Don't buy expensive flowers or toys for the graves because they'll get stolen or ruined. Don't overspend on a coffin because, again, he says the purpose of a body is to decompose back into the earth. Don't drink any water, even from fountains, in a cemetery, because I guarantee you, he said that water line has been in contact with a fresh grave. And don't plan Saturday funerals because no one will come. Plan your funerals during the work week where people will take off work to come. How very pessimistic of you, Chad. And with that, this useless book ends. I thought it was going to be more ghost stories, but it wasn't. But still, if I saved you the agony of having to read it, it took me about an hour and a half to power through this book, so it wasn't very long. And I read it Kindle, not Audible, so there you go. Another Chad Daybell book, another, 2 hours of my life wasted. I'm just kidding. It's never wasted as long as I get to chat about them with you. So anyway, I hope you enjoyed this. I'll be back really, really soon. And until next time, 𝗙𝗏𝗀𝐽.